All right, so welcome back to part two of our chapter 11 lecture on the ethics of punishment and corrections. And if we got done talking about punishment in general, and now we're going to jump right into the Eighth Amendment. So, the Eighth Amendment protects everyone from cruel and unusual punishment. And although, what is cruel and unusual can be a little bit vague, right? Several tests have been used to define the terms, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And they come underneath this case called Furman versus Georgia. So, again, these are some tests that have been used to define some of these terms as it relates to cruel and unusual punishment. So, really, what are those? Well, um, when you talk about it, it could be, we talk about unusual. Punishments that are rarely used become unusual. So maybe it's something a little bit different. Evolving standards of decency, punishments acceptable in the past, like flogging or something like that, may not be acceptable today. There's a legal term called, you know, shock the conscience, if you will, and that's important. So this is kind of a yardstick for all punishment is to test it against the public conscience, if you will. And if people are naturally kind of repelled by this punishment, it really must be cruel and unusual by definition. Excessive or disproportionate. Any punishment that is disproportionately administered or excessive to its purpose is considered wrong. And then unnecessary. The purpose of punishment, again, one of the purposes is to deter crime. Therefore, only that amount necessary to do so should really be administered. Okay, and these tests have eliminated the use of things like the whip and the branding iron. Yet some say that corporal punishment, at least the less drastic kind, such as whipping, is less harmful than a longer prison sentence. After all, right? A whipping takes perhaps days or weeks to get over, but a prison sentence may last years and affect all future earnings, etc. So, a couple of different schools of thought. Different schools of thought, right? And you could go even just a little bit further. And although probation, might be considered a slap on the wrist as a punishment, some conditions or rules that are attached to that probation right have been criticized as cruel. So-called like shaming conditions, include DUI offenders having special license plates that indicates that they've been arrested and convicted of DUI, or putting up signs in the yards of those that might be convicted sex offenders. So there's all of these other things for us to at least consider. So Braithwaite in 2000 and others distinguished between things called stigmatizing shaming and reintegrating shaming. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that. So the first is a rejection of the individual and has negative effects. So stigmatizing shaming basically rejects the individual and may have some type of stigmatizing effect. So basically the effect of punishment whereby the offender feels kind of cast aside or abandoned by the community. Whereas the reintegrative shaming rejects only the person's behavior, thus creating a healthier relationship between the individual and their particular community. Okay, so basically, here Braithwaite's idea is that certain types of punishment can lead to a reduction of recidivism, meaning going in and out of prison, right? If they do not involve banishment and they basically induce healthy shame, in the individual. So a couple of interesting terms just for us to understand. And another shaming punishment could be, a lot of times they have these programs where they arrest either prostitutes or those soliciting prostitution, and they publish their names and their pictures in the newspaper. That would be a form of a shaming punishment, right? And some people think that these are good and others kind of don't. But you can see the two different types by definition to be whether it's stigmatizing or whether it's reintegrative. Okay, so kind of staying with, incarceration, etc. We're going to now talk about supermax prisons. So prison authorities have long segregated the most notorious prisoners into special units. And today, some states have constructed the most secure facilities, which are referred to as supermax prisons. So a supermax prison is a term for a maximum security prison that describes the most secure prisons and prison units that again house the most dangerous criminals. Okay, and supermax conditions are really harsh, including individual separation of all inmates around the clock and very, very limited recreational activity. Now, there's challenges due to conditions, procedures, and who is sent there, right? Nonviolent, mentally ill. So these are all kind of challenges that have to really be taken into consideration. A couple of ones, just to give you an example, could be Pelican Bay State Prison is the only supermax facility in the state of California. It's located in Del Norte County, California. So this would be a picture of Pelican Bay. All right. So capital punishment. What sets capital punishment apart from all other punishments is its quality of irrevocability, meaning you can't take it back, right? And this type of punishment leaves no way to fix or correct a mistake, which is really why we have so many appeals in the process when it's a capital case, etc. Now, for this reason, some believe that no mortal should have the power to inflict capital punishment because there is no way to guarantee that mistakes may not be made in that particular process. Now, public support for capital punishment has kind of swung up and down. Public opinion polls reveal that public support for the death penalty declined gradually through the 1960s, reaching a low of 44% in 1966, but then increased over the next 30 years. In the late 1990s, and this is really when crime was at its peak, 75 to 80% supported the death penalty. Now, by 2008, only 63% supported capital punishment, and in 2016, 60% favored capital punishment for specific offenders, and that would typically be just murderers. Now, kind of an interesting document. Pew Research Center is a really great resource to go to. So Pew Research put something together in June of 2021, and it basically showed that more Americans favor than oppose the death penalty. 60% of U.S. adults favor the death penalty. Okay, but there's a caveat. 4 people convicted of murder, including 27% who are strongly in favor of it. About 4 and 10 or 39% oppose the death penalty, with 15% strongly opposing, according to this survey. And I put the link to the survey in there if you want to kind of look at it a little bit more. All right, so, does failure apply capital punishment fairly invalidate its use? The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled against, of course, executing those that are deemed mentally ill, those that have been deemed mentally handicapped, or, of course, juveniles under the age of 18. And kind of talking a little bit about punishment and crime? Should punishment be profitable? In many cases, poverty and not the seriousness of the crime is kind of, intricately linked or connected to how long someone is basically enmeshed or immersed or in the criminal justice system. And proponents argue that private corrections can save the state money. Private corporations are said to be more efficient. They can build faster with less costs and less red tape, and they have, kind of economies of scale. Now, a very troublesome element of privately run detainee centers and prisons is that they've been ruled exempt from open records laws, which apply to public agencies, right? So if you were trying to get some information on what's happening in their public record or open record, you would have a harder time because it's not a governmental type agency. So, these are all these things that we need to kind of think about, right? All right, so now we're going to kind of, as we start to wind down the chapter, talk about formal ethics for, correctional officers. And, as we talk about this, the American Correctional Association, or the ACA Code of Ethics, outlines formal ethics for correctional officers and other correctional personnel, if you will. And the code has many similarities to the law enforcement code of ethics that we talked about, if you remember back, in chapter 5. For instance, things like integrity, respect for and protection of individuals' rights, and the service, and service to the public are emphasized in both codes, and are really important to the sanctity of law, and also the prohibition against exploiting professional authority for personal gain is stressed in both codes. So these are things that kind of go across both law enforcement and correctional officers. Now, the ACA code indicates that members should exhibit again, things, honesty, respect for the dignity of individuality of human beings, and a commitment to professional and compassionate service. But here are some principles that are basically listed in the code, right? And we're going to kind of talk. So when you talk about the American Corrections Association, here are some of their principles. Protect legal rights. Show concern for the welfare of individuals. Promote mutual respect with colleagues. Respect and cooperate with all disciplines within the system. Provide public information as consistent with law and privacy rights. Protect public safety. Refrain from using one's position to secure personal privilege. Avoid conflict of interest. Refrain from accepting gifts. Differentiate personal views from work views. Report corrupt behavior. Refrain from discriminating because of race, gender, creed, national origin, religion, age, or disability. And preserve the integrity of private information. And finally, promote a safe, healthy, harassment-free environment, if you will. Now, in a interesting discussion of implementing an ethics program for correctional officers, Barrier in 1999 described how officers basically presented elements of what they thought were important in an ethics code. So these are what the officers thought was important. So, look at them, and they're actually very important. Acting professional, showing respect, maintaining honesty and integrity, being consistent, acting impartial, being assertive but not aggressive. And if you go back and you look at these, do you see a lot that are similar? So it's actually kind of nice to see that, these are what officers thought were important. Confronting bad behavior and reinforcing good. standardizing rule enforcement, respecting others, practicing the golden rule, encouraging teamwork, and using professional language. So, you know, a lot of interesting ones. Not abusing sick leave, telling inmates the truth, and then finally, which is really kind of interesting, admitting that you may have made a mistake. So again, some interesting comments, if you will, as it relates to maybe a code of ethics described, basically brought forward by officers. And then there are also some formal ethical guidelines for probation and parole officers that are provided by the ACA Code of Ethics. Maintain decorum in one's life. Avoid granting or receiving favors or benefits connected to the position. Uphold the law with dignity. Strive for objectivity in performance of your duty. Appreciate the inherent worth of an individual. Cooperate with fellow workers and related agencies. Improve professional standards. And then recognize the office that you work in, that career path that you chose, right, as a symbol of public faith. So it really is amazing how when you look at some different guidelines, how you can see the cross, right? A lot of them overlap. So what then, now that we've kind of looked at some different codes, let's finish up talking about occupational subcultures. So the correctional subculture has not been described as extensively as police subculture, but some elements are kind of similar. So first, the inmates may be considered the enemy, along with supervisors and society in general. And I know that's, kind of an interesting thing, right? So when you talk about it, moreover, the acceptance of, use of force, the preference towards redefining job roles to, meet only minimum requirements, and the willingness to use deceit to cover up wrongdoing seem to have, support in both subcultures. So when you talk about these subculture, it really hasn't been defined quite as much as policing, but some of the elements are typically seen to be similar. Now, Kaufman in 1988 notes the following as it relates. So in kind of a longer study of the officer's world, if you will, Kaufman notes the following norms of the correctional officer subculture. So number one, always go to the aid of another officer. So like law enforcement, the necessity of, that interdependence ensures that this is a strong and passive norm in the correctional officer subculture. Next, don't lug drugs. And this is, this prohibition is to ensure the safety of other officers, as is the even stronger prohibition against bringing in weapons for inmates. Okay, don't rat. That one's pretty self-explanatory. In ways like law enforcement subculture, some people believe they have this code, if you will, and ironically, the inmates do have a code. Correctional officers also don't like those who inform on their peers. Next, never make a fellow officer look bad in front of an inmate. Next, always support an officer in a dispute with an inmate. Next, always support officer sanctions against inmates. Next, don't be a white hat. And this is kind of a prohibition that is directed at any behavior, attitude, or expressed opinion that could be interpreted as sympathetic towards an inmate. Okay. Maintain officer solidarity against all outside groups. So this norm reinforces officer solidarity by making any other group, including the media, administration, or whoever, kind of the, even the public, the out group, not the in group. And then finally, show positive concern for fellow officers. So 2 examples could be: 1, never leave another officer a problem, which means don't leave unfinished business at the end of your shift for the next person to handle. And then number 2, help your fellow officer with problems outside the institution, which means maybe lending them money, to an officer that's injured or sick, or, helping out in whatever way you can. And realistically, if a correctional officer violates the subculture code, the sanctions are felt perhaps even more acutely than police officers, because one must work closely with these other correctional officers all day long in a very violent or possibly violent environment, right? You have to really be able to trust each other. So correctional officers must trust each other more completely, more implicitly, and basically more frequently, given the fact that violence in some institutions is pervasive and even unprovoked. And most of the time, the correctional officers are unarmed, right? They don't carry a weapon. So you're walking around amongst all these inmates, so you really do depend on each other. And fear of violating this code of silence, if you will, is one reason that officers do not report wrongdoing. Loyalty is another reason. Correctional officers feel is that strong, kind of band of brothers, or esprit de corps, and a pattern of complicity also prevents reporting. New officers can't possibly follow all of the many rules and regulations that exist in a prison environment and still adequately deal with inmates on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of times they may end up being a little bit, complicit. So before long, they find themselves involved in activity that could result in some type of disciplinary action, right? So, and because others are usually aware of this activity, and do not inform supervisors, that implicit kind of silence, if you will, kind of exists, where no one is turned in for anything, because each of the others who might witness this wrongdoing has really kind of engaged in that wrongdoing themselves, or some other type of issue. So, and as we kind of expand this out just a little bit, the subculture of probation and parole officers really has never been documented as extensively as that of police and corrections. So that's kind of an interesting thing. There really isn't a lot of information out there on probation or parole officers to any degree. And because of differences between these these different professions, if you will, the subculture of the former is not as pervasive or strong as of the latter. So, probation and parole officers do not feel as isolated as police or correctional officers do. They really don't experience stigmatism. They have normal working hours for the most part, and they don't, wear a, kind of a depersonalizing uniform, if you will. And they have a less obvious coercive relationship with their clients. And because of that, these factors reduce the need for a subculture. Now, still, one can probably identify some norms that might be found in any probation or parole office. And it could be, cynicism towards clients, or basically, kind of lethargy. Basically, the caseload may be so big that they're just kind of slow to get things going. It could even be individualism. An officer running his or her caseload in the manner that, they see fit. So all of these things could kind of be there. Now, even though there doesn't seem to be that blue curtain of secrecy, if you will, to the same extent found in policing, there really is no doubt that there is a norm against informing on colleagues for unethical behavior also in the probation and the parole area. So with that being said, thanks for hanging with me. I know there were quite a few definitions in this particular chapter, but we were able to kind of work our way through it. And then don't forget to do the key term exercises, and those will help you. Those are the non-graded exercises that basically focus on the definitions, and that'll help you as well. So that will conclude part 2 of chapter 11, the ethics of punishment and corrections.